Welcome everyone to the Wednesday, May 30th, 2012 meeting of the Brattleboro Planning Commission. Just a quick agenda review. We'll basically be talking about the town plan tonight. All town plan all the time. And so the first item is approval of the minutes of our last meeting, which was May 15th, 2012. Is there a motion? This is supposed to be the easy part. Okay. Is there a second?
I second.
Any discussion? Okay, hearing none. All in favor of accepting these minutes, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, the minutes have been accepted. Did I say welcome, everybody? Welcome
Yes.
to the meeting.
Good.
Now I really mean it. I was just going through the motions before, but I said welcome to the meeting. Thanks for coming.
Get it? The motions? You mean the motion?
Oh yeah, going through the motion, yeah, thank you. So next I have a couple of announcements. One of them we got in our packets. It's the public community meeting for housing alternative study for Melrose, Terrace, and Haze Court, put on by the Brattleboro Housing Authority. This is come one, come all. I'll read from the little poster. Learn more and share your visions and concerns. It's June 7th, which is
Next Thursday.
Next Thursday at 7 o'clock in the Melrose Terrace Community Room on George Miller Drive. And anybody who's watching and would like some information on it, you can get in touch with the Housing Authority, Brattleboro Housing Authority, or call and talk with Adam Hubbard at Stevens and Associates. The number at Stevens and Associates is 257-9329. And the other thing is that the Brattleboro Conservation Commission is presenting a Japanese knotweed workshop, and that's on June 12th from 5:30 to 7:30 at the Brattleboro Farmers Market by the covered bridge. And I'll read this one too. Join us for a hands-on demonstration with Brian Colleran, Vermont's Japanese knotweed coordinator, to discuss post-tropical storm Irene concerns about Japanese knotweed, learn how to effectively remove new populations, answer general questions about Japanese knotweed, find out how to help map populations of this and other invasive species. And probably the best thing is to call you, Sue, at the Planning Department office, and that's 251-8154. Are there any other announcements?
Yes. I'd just like to announce that the Exit 1 Gateway Citizens Group planted another garden over the weekend at Exit 1 in the median, and very successful. Lots of donations and a nice group of volunteers, and Police Chief Wren was there working with us and his wife, and that was great, and we had a great time.
All right, good deal.
And Paul Freed, who's done some of the other median strips, also came and helped with us.
That's really cool.
So take a drive by down Exit 1.
Looks great.
And the garden we planted last fall has really survived the winter and done well in really filling out that spot nicely.
Both sides look really nice now.
And Joe came and helped mow the lawn for us and loaned us another hose so we can get the hose closer to the, everybody's just pitching in. It's very exciting.
All right, good deal. Well, that's great. Thank you. Anything else?
Can I just, I don't know if you want this under announcements, but the Planning Commission was asked to meet with the Select Board on Tuesday night. Just the Select Board is taking the time to meet with each of the commissions and
All right.
boards, just kind of for an update. And so I'll send you the agenda when it's released, but if you can attend.
Next
I'm
Tuesday?
sure- Yep,
Yep.
The 5th?
I'm sure that would be appreciated, the support. Gary will be attending, but it's great to have more people show.
Yeah, you guys be there to defend me, okay? I'll say it wasn't my fault, and you have to say
What time
it
are
wasn't
we
your
at?
fault.
I
Hasn't
know
been
it's
set yet.
towards the beginning of the agenda.
So by 6:30 or so, you think?
Yeah, it hasn't.
Probably later, that
Ish.
takes that long just to get through the
6:45.
Yeah.
Depends.
You can watch it on
But if you were there
PCTV
by-
and then
Yeah, right.
Zip
head
down.
over.
Yes, it's sometimes it's hard to tell though.
I know.
Sometimes
I
I
know.
fly through some things. So.
Yeah.
As Jan Anderson would say, it's your select board. You're welcome to come and sit through the entire meeting.
Right.
Yes, that's right.
Just so everybody knows what it is, it's the select board is trying to do kind of a review with the different commissions and committees and everything, just to get a little bit of a progress report, I suppose, or
Yeah.
a status report.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what this is.
Yeah, and I think that they're interested in particular where we're at with the town plan and kind of what do you see after the town plan is adopted as moving forward.
Yeah. Okay, so everybody's welcome to come.
I have an announcement. On June 21st, there is a, I don't know what they're calling it, Next Gen Young Professionals Meetup.
Alright.
I'm not totally sure, but I think this is the one that Sevens is putting on. They're doing it, I think they're doing it once a month now. This past month, it fell on a day where there was 4 other things going on, so they actually canceled it. The first one was nice. There was about 30 people there.
Wow,
It was at the
great.
New England House. It was, I guess the point of it is networking and meeting other young people in the area. And by young, I mean
Under 60.
under 60.
Under 60. The 20 to 40.
I don't
right?
really know. It's one of those things. I don't think there's any real, young. I don't know. There's no.
What's the date of that again?
June 21st.
Where and when?
I have on here Wyndham Wine Bar, but I don't think that's
Under other
correct.
business.
I think that's still up for debate. I'm not.
Or
It
just
might
hold
be
it
at the
off.
marina.
Hold it off.
Actually, I'm not sure, but I can give you more information.
What time does it usually happen?
Is it like 5?
It starts at 5:30 and usually lasts about an hour to an hour and a half, and then there's social time afterwards.
Great.
Okay. Is there anybody, if people are watching and they want to know about it, is there somebody they could call or anything? Or a place to look on the net?
If this is, I'll tell you next meeting because I think it's Sevens who is run by Laura Sibilia.
Okay.
But
I have
I'm
a
not.
separate committee that's working with
Yeah,
the young task force or something.
yeah. So I think Laura Sibilia is the contact.
So anybody that wants to find out has to tune in to our next meeting to find out. Okay. That's a teaser for our next meeting on BCTV.
The teaser.
Okay.
Okay, any other announcements? So the next item is other business, and we have one thing there right now, opening for Wyndham Regional Commissioner. Would anyone from the department like to speak to that? Or is that self-explanatory?
It's mostly self-explanatory. Jim Brazino has been our commissioner for the past year, and he has decided that due to out-of-town work commitments, he can't keep this up. So traditionally, we have preferred that one select board member, and currently it's Dora Baboulis, and one planning commissioner act as commissioners to the Wyndham Regional Commission. So Jim has announced that he's not going to stand again. So we need to discuss and canvass a replacement.
When do they meet?
They meet the fourth
Third.
Tuesday
Yeah, fourth Tuesday
of the month for full commission. And
And
it tends to be in different locations throughout
Wyndham
the,
region.
the county,
Is it
or
at
in general.
Right.
nighttime meeting?
Yes, 7 p.m. It's typically, so you
7 or 7:30?
could possibly bump into some young people while you're doing this.
It might be 7:30.
Some under 50
You,
youngs.
you get to tour the region because the meeting location goes from sort of basically from member town to member town, roughly.
And there's usually at the full commission meetings, there's usually a presenter that's discussing a topic. And then there's kind of committees as well, and so usually commissioners serve on a committee. And those can vary as to their meeting times. So there's like a natural resources committee, there's a community development committee,
Brownfields.
energy committee.
Maggie's
Those
on
can-
it, aren't you, from your town?
Is
And what
you have
are
to be
the-
elected for it? Is that?
It's appointed by the select board.
Right. So the process is that the planning commission would nominate a member of the planning commission if a commissioner would like to volunteer to do it. So it's an additional time commitment over and above what you're currently doing.
Okay.
Nominate you.
Thanks, Joe. I'd do it. I mean, does anybody else want to do it?
I could do it, but I have a commitment on Tuesday night, so it just makes it in the fall and winter, so.
You seem like you'd be really
Oh,
a
yeah, I mean,
great
I'm-
representative, Timberlake.
Curious.
You can always do it for just a year, you
That's it,
know.
it's settled. I nominate Timberlake.
Yeah, it's a one-year appointment.
I second
Oh,
it.
that's not like 3 years of planning commission.
Oh,
No.
that's okay.
Yeah, it's not a long-term sentence.
If nobody else wants to do it, I'll do it.
Great.
Wow.
Now that's enthusiasm.
Yep.
There.
Right, is that like
Yeah.
hot potato?
So it sounds like Timberlake's got the job then? Is that it?
Joe?
No, Timberlake.
Well,
I nominate Timberlake.
the other competitors aren't here to speak for themselves,
Far
probably.
more qualified.
James might want to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think at the end, I mean, last year, I think Jim did have to, submit, when they accept committee and, vacancies, I think did he have to submit something? I think he had to
Like a
fill
letter
out the
of interest or
volunteer,
something.
application.
There's a form, an application form to be a volunteer for the commission, and then I think he
Do
did
it online.
provide a letter. I recall doing that. Yeah.
It's a MAPS online form.
Yeah. Yeah, you
Sign
can
off
submit
on my
online.
IT hours for me.
Right, you can find it, you can find a link to it on Brattleboro.org.
For Wyndham Regional, yeah.
Yeah, for all those town
For all
boards and
of it,
committees,
yeah.
it's one application for all of you, just click.
Yep.
Oh, yes. For the town it is, and then but then Wyndham Regional, I think, needs a letter.
No, the town provides the letter to them.
Right.
They don't.
Okay, well, it's settled, I think.
Besides, you're part of that ultimate age group, we need a good representative from that age
That's
group
right.
on the regional
Let the young people
commission.
do it. They have lots of energy.
That's right. They don't fall asleep after 7:30 at night. Like some of us. Oh my gosh, that's only an hour away. We better get going.
Yeah, really.
You better hurry up, Gary.
Yeah. Okay, so, any other business? I like saying that, so.
Other business?
Yeah. So the next thing is public comment, and we have one member of the public here, and Maggie, if you're here to talk about anything other than the town plan, this is your time. Okay? And then there'll be plenty of time to talk about the town plan. Thank you for coming. Okay, well, the next part is what we're here for, really. Edits to the draft town plan. And one of the things that we, when we got these books, the idea is that all the people on the commission would read through their draft chapters and make notes, and then comments, questions, and so forth, we will talk about at this meeting and then the next meeting, and then try to assimilate everything that's appropriate to assimilate into the plan itself. So what Sue has done is, since Liz isn't here, but she forwarded her comments. Sue created some larger topic areas. So there's those three, and then the two behind you guys on the whiteboard.
Yeah.
One is need more info. So if there's something, if there's a topic or a sentence or a point in the plan that you think needs more information, that would be something that would get written down there. And Sue we'll say what we're going to say, and Sue's going to write it in the appropriate place. And then suggested cross-references, things that are left out, but more like a bigger topic, or a chunk of stuff, rather than just more information about something that is there. And then too much information, and then contradictions, which is really, sounds a little philosophical, but.
So these are, what's written there is what what Liz sent in?
Yeah, it was a start. She was kind of on her way out of town and was running out of time, so she was going to spend some more time with it. But in general, this is what she sent me.
Okay.
I put something on too much information that I've kind of thought, does it really need to be in there? Otherwise, I've kind of withheld my comments at this point.
Yeah.
But it was just something to get it started.
Shape the conversation.
Yeah. One of hers that isn't on there, that is kind of, I guess, a little bit more structural in nature, and I wasn't exactly sure where to put it, but is worth discussing, is the structure that we've set up is that the goals, policies, and actions are at the front of the chapter. Then you have the text. She kind of used the goals, policies, and actions as an outline for the chapter, and she felt that there were some chapters where it didn't flow like that. The text didn't flow like that. In particular, she mentioned energy and natural resources. Those are the two that she pointed out at this time. So, perhaps there's room to think about that a little bit and to discuss that.
Well, that might be something that we could talk about tonight or right away. Is we decided a long time ago to have the goals and policies and actions at the beginning, and then whatever fleshing out those needed plus other narrative would go after that, and that was kind of. Didn't Liz have a bit of a question about that, if that was the right way to go or not, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
No, I think that Liz probably started up around the time we made that decision to switch it and put it to the front.
Yep.
And I think that some of the chapters were written, I can speak to natural resources. So there is the potential to have a lot of goals and policies and actions on natural resources, because it's one of our longest chapters outside of land use. And so I think we were trying to, because we had made the decision we didn't want a ton of that in the plan, I think I tried to shorten them up. And so just have a couple that, and so that could be one reason why it doesn't really follow the text of the chapter. I think as we moved on, that there is kind of that, there is that link to it. I think in land use in particular, I think, arts was done early, but those goals and policies came out of the work that the Arts Committee did on behalf of the Planning Commission. So there was a direct link there.
So a direct link between the stuff that's at the beginning and then the text.
And then what's in the text,
follows.
yeah. I think in particular she felt there were actions that weren't necessarily justified in the text. I don't know if any of you saw that as well. So we were proposing things that there was no background for.
And especially in those two chapters?
Yes.
I think that's true of energy also. So I think
Yeah, it was
Yeah, I'm
energy
looking at
management.
energy now.
I think that from a writing standpoint, I benefited a lot from Liz's comments on economic development, which basically involved, once the chapter was written, going back to the goals and policies and action steps, which had been discussed at a planning commission, meeting a couple of times and formulated in a particular way, and then the chapter unfolded in a slightly different direction. So that wasn't huge, but it was beneficial in terms of tying what is effectively the outline of the chapter to the chapter itself. In energy, something similar happened. So the front part, the goals, actions, and policies and action steps, kind of works as an outline for the chapter, but I don't think each of the action steps in particular are necessarily
Doesn't follow.
well, it's just not carried through to that degree. I think I don't think it necessarily warrants a major rewrite. It's just a minor adjustment. It'll be a little bit time consuming, and it benefits from having more than one reader do it. So part of the problem is, as the writer, you think that you just talked to it, or that somewhere in here you did because you're thinking about it the whole time. But it's better for somebody else to read it. It's a real editing thing that comes more clearly from someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know how much everybody has written down, or if you've got notes, but and I didn't get through all the chapters. I got up to land use, so
Okay.
I've probably got 20 things to say, not really big things, but but we can start with anybody who wants to start. Yeah. Okay. And then
Are you okay with this?
I didn't mention that. So we'll do this at 2 meetings, and then the goal is to have the draft finalized so that we can warn, so we can put our so-called final stamp of approval on it.
Yep.
And warn it at the end, at our second meeting in June, so that warn it for a public hearing, which can't happen for another 30 days after that. So that wouldn't be until the end of July, or early August, probably more like. So
Right.
so that's the goal here. And remember, the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yep.
This will not be perfect, but it'll be good.
And just so you know, we've also alerted Town Plan Advisory Group, Maggie, and other members that the draft is available, and we've kind of canvassed them to find out interest, if there's interest in meeting to kind of discuss some of these same things that we're discussing here, but to have that other set of eyes on it. And so far, the response has been pretty positive. So
Yeah.
I think
we've got
in
them
that time we'll be.
Great.
doing that as well.
Okay. Great.
Yeah. On the last note, we presented finally to the department heads this morning on the same material, and so they're also encouraged to provide factual corrections in particular.
So they got copies of all of
They
it.
got copies of the goals and policies and action steps section, and a copy of municipal facilities, and directed to the website for other material as they, depending on their interest.
Great. So I can just say what I have written here.
You have another presentation I'd like to do, so I didn't bring it over. Sure, okay. That's on its own right now. Check it out. Thank you.
Hey Sue,
Sorry about that.
you got a marker over there?
Okay, markers.
All right.
I'm going to add them to these until I run out of space.
So the agriculture chapter, one of the things, 1.2 is about the agriculture committee doing the inventory of the agricultural land. And I'm not trying to be a wise guy, but will they do that? Do you think?
We talked about it last year.
Uh-huh.
They generally meet when they need to.
I mean, do you sense that do you think they see that as part of their charge if it goes into the town plan?
In other words, is that realistic?
Is it? Yeah.
I'm not trying to put you on
I
the
mean,
spot,
it's been a
but-
while since they've met. At
Yeah.
that time, they had reviewed the chapter. We talked about that.
Yeah, okay,
You know.
yeah.
It's a good point, though.
Well, just a question, because I know in the past they've had a really, basically a stated thing that they do, and, that would be outside of what they're accustomed to doing, I think. Another question I had was, I sort of an occupational thing, but timber as a crop, I don't think that concept is in the plan at all, and it is something that is real. It's not in the energy chapter either, biofuels. So I think it's a resource that we have, and it would be good to maybe mention it in here someplace.
Where do you all think? Do you see it in both energy and agriculture? Do you see it? Does the commission have a?
To me, in the energy chapter, there should at least be the word biofuel someplace.
It doesn't turn up? That's interesting.
Well, I don't think so, but it may be there, Ron, and I
Yeah,
didn't see it. But
it was definitely the intention to have it there somewhere.
yeah. Well, it's sort of poignant to me because we had that wood heat thing
Right.
just a couple weekends ago, and
Right.
so well attended again too.
And then
I know that the tendency, I think it probably is an American thing that people don't think of farms having a crop being trees, but certainly part of the idea kind of in current use,
Yep.
So,
And there was somebody at the economic development hearings that talked about various other timber uses in the forest as moneymakers, economic, and I forget what they all were. It was there was mushrooming is one thing, but there was something else too. I can't remember right now what it was, and so that's a good point.
actually there's two paragraphs under renewable energy that have
Right.
mention of biofuels, and
Yep.
so I don't know, that may be enough, but I just wanted to call it out a little bit,
do you think, I think that one of the things that I caught missing in the plan is really a discussion of our forestry resources, and I was inclined to add that to the natural resources chapter.
Sure.
I don't, I could talk about it as a crop, in that
Yeah,
aspect. I mean,
as long as it's called out, I think, because it is a resource, and so in natural resources, if that's the sort of place that it could be.
Yeah, actually, it's a little bit fragmented, I guess. At some point, we had attempted. So I think it needs to come in agriculture, natural resources, but probably in natural resources tied to land cover.
yeah.
The sort of the form of the land and how much of it is dominated by woodlands, and then in energy and economic development, talk about it as a potential economic asset,
Right.
and then in land use, talk about it as an asset both from an aesthetic standpoint and an economic one. Does that make sense, Sue?
Yeah.
And don't some farmers, I mean, when they're, I hear people, when they look at land, they look at how much open pasture they have and how much, sometimes if there's forested areas also, and so that they can have timber as a resource, whether it's for logging or something else.
Sure, yeah. And, I mean,
So
the
I think it
idea
goes
is
in
that
ag also.
it's an economic resource when it's managed and everything, so.
Right.
And where this kind of came up, and I've talked with you about it before, Sue and Rod too, that, in Austria, the district heating schemes are developed by farmers. They develop them so that they have a ready market for their wood chips from their managed forests. So it's a real,
So it's sustainable and it's a business for them and it's.
yeah,
it's an
and we
energy
would
thing.
never think of it that way. We would never think that people that have farms would be the ones that would be advocates for putting in district heat in town, but that's how that works there in places. So it's an interesting thing, and it's not the way that we think about it here. So.
Right. Okay. Yeah, at some point we'd come across a couple of different sources of information, including in the comprehensive energy plan, there's discussion of the growth in total percentage of people who at least heat with wood part of the time,
Yeah.
and how it's one explanation for the flattening out of electricity consumption in the last 10 or so years, because people have switched to wood. And the lack of growth in fuel oil, not price, but gallons used and kilowatt hours used of electricity.
Yeah.
So it's significant. Yeah, okay. Do we need to discuss it a little bit around what's the policy again?
Current use.
Current use in natural resources. Is that how it gets discussed in natural resources now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And then to go back to Carolina's point, one of the things that came up in the economic development hearings, there was a person whose name I can't recall who was associated with wood used for craft or furniture making, and felt like there was a nascent high-end furniture making kind of
Yeah, that's right.
group of businesses.
Certain kind of woods that are in the forests that contribute to high end.
And the regional plan used to contain information on hardwood exports out of Windham County. It's supposed to be one of our biggest exports. So maybe we just need to tease out those links a little bit better, so that because it turns up as a goal, an action step to identify alternative energy as an industrial cluster. But we probably need to do a little bit better job of explaining that or describing that.
And then forest products generally.
And forest products generally.
Forest
Yeah,
products.
that's
Right.
economic.
The challenge there is that we know that it is.
Yeah.
We really know that it is. But it's all blacked out. It's literally blacked out. When you go to review the data, it's blacked out for confidentiality reasons, because it's dominated by two large,
Yeah.
one very large and one fairly large local business. And so because they have such a strong control of the market, you actually can't get data on the market.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh.
Well, but I think that when you're looking at it at a regional level, there is a lot more exporting. I'm not sure that
Yeah.
Brattleboro's woods are being exported as much.
No,
as
I don't think they
the
are.
region. I mean, you take Wyndham alone.
Yeah. Right.
So,
So then it, it's sort of hard to say.
yeah, I'm not sure that we can back it up with the numbers because of the number of industries that are actually in Brattleboro.
Right.
But I think even just identifying it as.
You could even take some state numbers and interpolate what it would be for Wyndham County or for Brattleboro based on acreage or something like that. Just at least to show what some of the potential might be, that kind of thing.
We have a couple of really big mills. We have,
Yeah.
we have people who are brokering and
Yeah.
wood products. We have a lot of people on the right plate. We can describe something going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
It's like value-added products in ag. There's
Yeah.
really kind of value-added products in the forestry, timber.
I'm intrigued about the furniture aspect because we talked about that before, and I didn't know that it already, had taken off to some extent. So, yep, all right.
And just I put a question mark for link to economic development under agriculture because I don't know. I didn't see that actually said there, but and I know we've talked about it before, and I didn't know.
Yeah, I think we need to
You go back and do
pick
it.
up on that as well.
Right.
It's making a
Because
connection if you're reading the agricultural chapter.
right.
Yeah. Okay. And then the last point I had written about agriculture was just that there isn't a lot of data in the chapter about the dollar value of agriculture, the economic value, and I know we've talked about that as well, and I know that was hard to come by, but there also might have been more information in the economic development chapter about the dollar value of agriculture. I didn't write that down afterwards, but I mean,
You could get the information at a county level.
Yeah, it's a bit challenging at a lower.
hard to get it for town.
Yeah, and Brattleboro actually is significantly different enough from the surrounding towns that it makes it really complicated to do the very simple math,
For the
right?
town itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is not to say. I mean, we can get at it a little bit, I think, with the number of people involved in agriculture as an occupation, and that's not a great number.
It's not a good number,
It's tiny,
and that's not really
so it
the
doesn't.
way the industry's working in Vermont either.
No.
So
Right, right, exactly. So there's reasons why we kind of gloss it a little
It gets
'Cause
bigger
then-
when you look at the county as a whole.
because the numbers don't do it justice in a funny kind of way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the number of people who, Dana is an example. So she's involved in agricultural production at home on her land. She works for cash, daily, in an office. She's both a farmer and an office worker. So when you go to measure those kinds of contributions, it's difficult. Her cash income from her 9-to-5 job is way bigger than her agricultural income, but possibly in terms of her identity or her contribution to the flavor of the town, if you like, her agricultural activity may be more significant for her and for us in some ways than her office job.
Yeah.
And I don't want to put word, speak for her, but that's sort of what I'm getting at. So there's really large number of people who fall into that category, and it's a growing category. And some states are better at identifying that than others. New Hampshire, for instance, is really good and has an extension service, for instance, that even runs specific workshops for women involved in part-time agriculture and that kind of stuff. We don't, and it's not like California or something where we could say that there's so many thousands of acres under beans, and that it's got this many thousands of workers, picking them.
Yeah.
It's just not that kind of agriculture.
And the other thing is that Brattleboro is the site for the farmers markets, and so that may not be production that comes from Brattleboro, but it's production that comes to Brattleboro, and so
Right.
it's a significant activity, that's for sure, in town. So
Right.
So last night we had this gathering with Bab and a couple other groups, and it was basically asking the question to a bunch of younger people who moved here from cities who just decided to settle here for whatever reason. And one of the reasons that came up was that they like the idea of being able to grow their own food, and they like the idea of living off the land and this, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So it came to the conversation of, if you're employed, it's how many people in Brattleboro, comparatively speaking to other places, have a full-time job, a 9-to-5 job. I've never lived in a place where people have so many different jobs and have so much flexibility with their schedule. And part of that was because they wanted to work a job, but they also wanted to do farming. And wolfing is becoming this,
Yes.
you know, so I feel like in a roundabout way, agriculture, and I don't know if this, I haven't read this chapter specifically yet, but is there something to be said for using agriculture as a way, as an asset for our community, and saying that it's part of the reason people, quality of life, part of the reason people live here, and it could be an interesting half-time job market for people, especially people trying to find their way when it doesn't pay a lot, but it's a way to earn income around here.
I think it's part of the very, potentially overused term, working landscape. So I think that one of the things that makes Vermont attractive to people not from here is that when they see pictures of Vermont or travel here, it is agricultural. I guess I have some other kind, and I get the appeal of it because it's on a scale that is more human. So if you visit agricultural communities in the Midwest or in the West, it's actually a little on the creepy side in terms of the sheer dimensions of it and the smell and how hyper productive it is, and it's industry. They're sort of not messing around. It's really big scale. So very large farms, large numbers of workers, processing plants, and large machinery, and large parts of town given over to supplying materials and fixing machinery and those kinds of things. It's all on a scale necessary to produce a lot of food. Whereas if you look at the so-called working landscape of Vermont, it's probably more equivalent to what ordinary American farms look like in the 1940s and the 1950s. And so there's a kind of a comfort factor. But it's more affordable, and it's more easily managed, and probably, at least in perception terms, less risky. So I think that, if you're interested in organic farming or some kind of different farming strategy or small scale stuff, that New Hampshire and Vermont and upstate New York might be more appealing in that way than other parts of the country. So it is appealing as a destination for that reason. I think working landscape pretty much captures it, though.
Supporting the Vermont brand. I mean, it's part. I feel like it's more than working landscape, though. I feel like it's part of.
My suggestion is that on page 3 of the agricultural chapter, Future of Farming, the Next Generation, the way it's written right now is really geared towards educating the people, kids that are in school right now. What do we have at this level? But I mean, I think we could put something in there about the younger set or anybody that, I was saying that the future of farming in Brattleboro is never going to be that big agribusiness. We don't want to be, but we see the future of farming in Brattleboro as, the smaller scale. I don't want to call it hobby farming because that's not, but.
But it can be somebody's entrance into it. It's easy to get into here. You can go work at Walker Farms, or you can, lots of kids do that, and it's a way to get involved with it and check it out, and then maybe
They do it at Lilac
we do
Ridge,
it
too.
more. Yeah. So,
There's talk of creating an agricultural incubator out at Joe Familari's, and that's one of the things that's also come out of the economic hearings there.
Right.
That's actually, there's talk about it. So, and there's nothing mentioned there, or there's the possibility of creating that. And also, just to back up Timberley's, when Michael Schumann was here, he talked about, again, agriculture as kind of, it's never been, it doesn't get looked at as an economic engine, but it's really one of those things that's hugely under-acknowledged and just waiting to be developed, especially as prices of fuel go up and whatnot, and the prices of food go up, that creating a more regional, resilient food economy, and that we're really poised here with that kind of small farm, the kind of land we have, to be able to plug that in and for people to be able to do that. So I think that goes along with what Timberley's saying.
so
And it's just
I'm-
not mentioned there in any way.
Okay.
If I'd be happy to go through this stuff quickly that I have written down, and then
Yeah.
Yep.
we can all do that and see where it fits in. You know,
We'll work on that. I mean, there's a couple other different angles there, but I think we can figure something out.
Yeah, in the economic development chapter, under one of the goals, you're talking about developing industry clusters, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that could just be, it doesn't include agriculture, but.
Well,
it is in there.
it's under food and nutraceuticals,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
which
But agriculture is different.
um,
It is, but
okay.
I don't know.
So Gary,
Yeah.
you got some more on egg?
Yeah, no more on ag.
Okay.
Um,
Are you going to move straight to arts and culture, or
Sure.
All right.
Next thing. The only thing I have there, I kind of did a count of goals, policies, and actions for each chapter, and a lot more for arts and culture than there are for agriculture, and but I know those were developed by the Arts Committee, and my only question there was, it sounds like they have a lot of stuff in front of them. There's like 13 action steps, and most of them have their name after them.
Yeah,
and
why
so-
is that?
Why is that?
I like that?
Because they're the ones that
They wrote it.
wrote it, yeah.
They didn't write it, they gave us,
Or,
They gave it,
Not wrote it,
right.
but they were the ones.
they reviewed it and they,
They're up for it.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're very active there.
so that was just my only observation there. Economic development,
Oh, so that's your only comment on arts and culture?
that's it. I think
Okay.
it's a good chapter.
Yep.
You already have written down links to economic development
Yeah.
for art, so I had that written down too. Under economic development, I see that, instead of a value at the beginning, you have a principle, and I know we talked about this, but I don't remember,
We may have just,
different.
I think I just left the term principle in there probably by accident more than anything else. So that it can just come out.
Just different wording
Yep.
than the rest of the chapters.
Okay. That's a good graph. I never would have noticed it after a while.
And, I see that the actions in that chapter don't have I don't know what we're calling them, an accountable party or,
Oh, right.
and I don't remember if we talked about that or not, but
I think an early iteration it did.
did it? Okay.
I may need to go back over that. We certainly didn't discuss this set, so maybe that's something. Sue, do we want to flag that for a discussion when everybody else is here? Maybe.
But, they also did a count on the action steps of how many said support and how many said encourage,
Oh, interesting.
as opposed to other action verbs.
Well,
And in that chapter, there were 22 actions, and 6 started with support, and 3 started with encourage, for what it's worth.
okay.
But there's a lot of actions there. So the other 13 were all, pretty action oriented, I would say. So
Right.
I thought that was good.
Good. It's an area where it's a stretch. There's a lot of coaxing and encouraging and
Right.
affirming, but not a lot of actual things we can do.
Right. And then I had a question about cluster data.
Yep.
When I read about, the paragraphs about clusters, it's very understandable and everything. It almost seems like you're citing data, but there's no data. Or is there data someplace?
There is very limited data, and it's kind of, squishy.
I remember the data on the state,
Yep.
on the state things. And,
Yep.
Gary, do you have a specific page or?
Yeah.
well,
Is it page 10?
8 and 9, I guess,
Okay.
'cause it's all about clusters, but there's not a lot of data there. And
When the tables get revised, they'll link more closely, hopefully, to the text. So there's 2 basic sets of data. One is the number and type of business establishments, and then the other one is the number of different occupations and the percentages of people employed in different occupational categories.
Okay.
And so they kind of go together. It's not a perfect fit, and the data is a little weird.
Yeah.
So that's hopefully where the discussion about clusters will get better developed. I have to say that the defending things like so to go to Carolina's point about the difference between agriculture and food, for instance,
Yeah.
the title it's given to the cluster that includes agriculture is agribusiness, which is a bit of a turnoff, but
Yeah.
that's the term from the data, and food technology. So that encompasses everything from farming, with the sort of predictable picture of farmers in their overalls doing their thing, through to veterinarians regularly testing cow herds and all that kind of stuff, through to people maintaining the equipment at Grafton Cheese or the yogurt plant, which is a highly kind of scientific white coat kind of deal, and marketing and everything else in between. And that is showing reasonable growth. I can't tease it out enough to figure out how much of that is actually growth in farmers. And to get back to the example of, earlier on in the discussion, the sense that I have is the actual number of real farmers, in boots is not increasing. Right. But there's more of this kind of activity associated with, farming here and our location and a whole bunch of things.
I think all that is really compelling, and I think the narrative is good. I think it would be even stronger if there was some data, even if there was an example of one cluster, say it was farming and food,
right,
that said, and these are the sorts of occupations included in this,
right,
so that people reading it might expand a little bit their thinking about, the whole topic.
Okay.
And like we've talked about before, how much economic activity has always been related to printing around here, for instance. And without thinking about it and talking about it, you may not consider it a whole lot. But
Right.
when I think about the time I've been here and how many printing-related jobs
Yes.
there have been over all these years, it's just something that you don't put together necessarily. So I think it's a good subject,
Right.
and could be.
Right.
And I know it's hard because you don't want to count the same job in 4 different things,
No. No.
or anything like that. But
And one of the problems we have is that because of them putting, from an occupation standpoint, agricultural workers and forestry workers are lumped together for obvious reasons, because you could work as a farm laborer or a farmer and find yourself working, in forestry as well,
Yeah.
depending on
Yeah.
the seasons and the time,
Yeah.
and all that kind of stuff.
yeah,
But because of the dominance of a handful of businesses, it's all blacked out. So I can't get in there and go, most of these women are involved in agriculture, and that's good. I can't go there. There's no numbers there.
yeah.
So that's one of the really weird challenges that I've got.
Okay.
Yeah.
On page 11 in that chapter, in the first paragraph, the second paragraph, I'm just wondering about. I know we talked a bit about removing the economic impact assessment requirement on 65,000 square foot store size. And it's hard for me to see a compelling reason to do that, given the possible conflicts that people might have with that. And because it's hard to reconcile, the statement of reduce that likelihood of large-scale retail development isn't very likely. But then to follow that up with the idea to take the economic impact assessment requirement away, it seems like picking a fight on something that may not have much of a return. I mean, I understand that if somebody came in and they wanted to do a 70,000 square foot development and they found the economic impact assessment requirement to be onerous, that might send them to New Hampshire, which is probably where they would go anyway. And I think that's anyway. That's and that may be picky in the whole scheme of things, but I think if somebody was really reading through it and they lived through the 65,000 square foot store size cap
Oh, God.
discussion, that might not go down very well. So that's my 2 cents about that. I continue to wonder about, the new market tax credit program. While I think it's great, and I think it's great if it helps to make things happen in town. It's a hard conflict to me that's not necessarily where the infrastructure that exists that is underutilized is, so much, because it's in a different area. But, say la vie, I guess. On page 13, talk about increasing population and accelerating economic development. And I just, I know this is the vexing question, is what are the ways and means of doing that? Because, there is the fact, I think, and everybody agrees, that It'd be great to increase the population, especially of younger people, and great to accelerate economic development. I know that's what everybody's trying to figure out now and everything. I just don't know if those things spring up, you know. And I don't know, Rod, if did you have in writing that, about that? Are there those things, or is it just to be determined, or you know? I mean, I know that the SEVID's effort is largely about that kind of stuff, and
the tone that I was trying to take here was a little bit different from the SEVID's material in an important way, and I guess at lunch I was reading the New York Times online, and there's an article that kind of helps explain this a little bit. So it was mostly looking at cities in Ohio, such as Dayton, and other so-called Rust Belt cities that have lost huge amounts of young people, college-educated people who've gone away to college, who've grown up in those communities in secure neighborhoods in households with high incomes and high standards of living associated with their participation in manufacturing. And then so the children grow up in well-resourced schools and make the most of that and go away to college, and then now they've completed college, there's nothing for them back there at all because manufacturing in those towns has collapsed. And so there's a lot more interest, unbelievably, in economic geography circles and others to look at the new map of jobs in America. And so it turns out that cities the size of Dayton and similar are competing really strongly to try and recruit college age or just graduated college students back to those communities. And what they're confronting is on a much larger scale similar to what we're confronting, which is for people with choices, and many college age or just graduated college students have got choices. They want to be where there are people like them and a range of activities and lifestyle choices, if you like, in terms of the neighborhood and how they're going to live and how they're going to spend their time that are really different from somewhere like Dayton. So they're not going back. And there's a really big shift on. So there are winning cities and there are definitely losing cities. I would say that Brattleboro, like most rural communities, is somewhere in that mix. And we may be losing, but we may be actually losing less than bigger cities like Dayton or Youngstown or somewhere similar. Some cities have been much more successful at turning it around than others, and it's complicated to try and figure out the exact menu. So, but what I'm trying to do here is relate the assets that Brattleboro has to those big trends. So where I would probably differ from the SEVID's position is, I think the SEVID's position is a bit bleaker than mine, and partly because...
Well, that's good.
Yeah, well, I've worked hard at that,
Trying to out-bleak them,
or? No, I can't out-bleak them, so I'm going for the happy approach to economic development.
All right.
Because they've really cornered that bleak thing. And so I think the best way to think about it is to think about your peers, And so I don't think we're doing so bad. I think it could be a lot worse. And I think that many other communities, without wanting to pick on Dayton, it sucks. I mean, it's in the middle of nowhere, and there's not a whole lot going on. And there's not a whole lot going on for a really good distance around Dayton, right? You can drive for 3 hours out of Dayton, and it's not that different. You can drive 3 hours out of here and you're in either New York City or Boston. So, there are just these really big differences. And that's what amounts to our set of assets. It's small and compact, it's walkable. We've got all these things going for us that make us very attractive as a destination. I think as much as it's difficult for some people to hear, the cost of living here in terms of housing and so forth is relatively good compared to Boston or Washington, D.C., or a much bigger city. We may not compare favorably with a large number of Western state communities for complicated reasons, but compared to the Eastern Seaboard, it's relatively affordable, it's relatively safe, it's attractive, and it's easy to get back to large metropolitan areas if that's where your work or life takes you. So that's what I'm trying to get at here, to some extent, in this discussion. And then the other thing that I want to get at is, I think Brattleboro's actually got a pretty good history as being a welcoming community for people in the region, growing up, young people in surrounding towns and finding their way, like starting off in life from Brattleboro, in an apartment or with the starter job or whatever, out of high school or even out of college. And that's just a curious combination of the number of jobs, the kind of housing stock, and all that kind of stuff. So if you're just getting on your feet from growing up in a surrounding town, you might find yourself here, and that's pretty welcoming. We're welcoming to people of different circumstances and backgrounds for whole lots of complicated reasons. Some to do with the schools and colleges that we have here, some to do with the large health institutions like the Retreat and other places. And so we're pretty open on a certain level. But that also can't, and we've been, as a community, I think, fairly generous and interested in supporting people whose circumstances are challenging. But for us to continue to afford doing that, we're going to need to pay attention to being more economically successful than we are, because we're getting to the point where funding that generosity of spirit is becoming more and more challenging. And part of it's to do with the changing federal and state settings for support, and part of it's just to do with dwindling taxes or just those long-term shifts. So we need to reinvigorate the community to keep the promise that we've made to ourselves, which is that we're going to try and be gracious in our extension of generosity to people who are less fortunate. And so that's partly what I'm trying to address here. And then I think on another level deeper down, I don't want people to lose sight of the significance of the poverty and the hardship that's present in Brattleboro by constantly talking about getting lots more exciting young people who are going to spend money in bars and buy new cars, because I think that, that's difficult. As important as it is, it's difficult. But there's another really important issue and reason why we want to do economic development, and that's because there are many people living among us that need more access to opportunity. And so that's a kind of economic development that's a little bit different from making ourselves really attractive to new graduates or Brooklyn refugees,
The last thing I had about economic development was that we talked a little bit about some sort of a person or a position about economic development.
You got it in terms of municipal.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, okay. So is that in the municipal
It's in the
service?
municipal.
Oh, okay.
Right. Yeah. And actually, it doesn't come up as a point in the economic development chapter. And I guess do we want to go back and yeah.
I misunderstood what you were saying. I talked about looking at the sustainability measures of the town in the municipal chapter.
Oh.
I did not go either place. I mean, I didn't talk about having somebody that handles economic development for the town
Oh, yeah.
in the municipal services.
So hang on a second. Let me try and get this straight. I think we may have talked about this a little bit when we discussed the economic development chapter, but it's not in here yet, which is.
I actually think.
Or do we
didn't
discuss
talk
it in
about
municipal
much then,
services?
but yeah.
Okay.
We talked about it in terms of the finance committee report. That's how it came
Yeah.
up.
Right.
And Gary had questioned how come we don't have, Rockingham's got Bellows Falls has an economic development director. How come Brattleboro doesn't? It should show in the minutes, but,
Yeah, I think we decided that we wanted to put it in, but I'm not sure where we said we were going to put it in.
I don't think we said exactly where, but
Yeah.
it
Okay.
wasn't said in, what I was referring to was
left.
So maybe it needs to occur, like some discussion of it or justification for it needs to occur maybe in economic development, and then it needs to reoccur in municipal services and facilities.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like as a commission, we decided that that was an important thing, so.
Okay. So actually, just to go back to that discussion that I just had with you, Gary, I actually do set a population growth target of what looks to be amazingly small.
1.5%, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that works out to about 256 breathing people in a 10-year period, which doesn't sound like very much, but remember, it's a net number.
Did you say breathing or breeding?
Breathing.
Oh.
Breeding would be great, but I don't think we can really demand that. So,
Whether it will work out or not, I don't know.
so, I mean, that's sort of, to go back to the sort of service style comparison too, if you look at population changes for Greenfield, even for Keene is a pretty steady chug up for the last 20 to 30 years, which is exactly what you'd expect for a college town like Keene. Bennington's like this, up 4%, down 4%, up 2%, down 2% from one census period to the next. So kind of wavy, which is more what you'd associate with loss of manufacturing jobs, which has probably been more severe in Bennington than it has been here and is a bigger part of the Bennington economy than it is here. And then Greenfield, a little bit like this, which is surprising given the existence of the community college, but it's stabilized a little bit and is showing some slowish growth. Brattleboro is flatlining. It's kind of astoundingly flat. And so, but you know, when you average it out, I don't know what's better, to do the Bennington thing or just to do this, very straight, flat. The composition of our population, I think, is a little bit harder to get at. And that's more challenging. So settling on a growth rate of 1.5 was kind of a stab in the dark, but conservatively, I think 2 is clearly difficult to sustain. 1.5 is a pretty good goal. It doesn't amount to that many people, but it's surprisingly hard to keep people overall for over a 10-year period because it is a net figure. So I'm talking about after all the graduating classes of however many years it is in 10 years of high school, you know, moving out, there is this sort of demographic bump coming along where family size is already getting smaller. So I think it would be quite a dramatic turnaround to achieve a 1.5% increase by 2020.
And I think, you know, we talked a lot about the infrastructure and everything, and it's simplistic maybe for me to say this, but it seems like we almost have to grow into our infrastructure because I think we have more than we need, you know, so we have this constant cost that isn't being used, and you know, so I think, I mean, the yogurt factory was something that would use some infrastructure that was available. You know,
Added a bit too. It added a bit too.
Yeah, but you know, that sort of thing, though, you know, and anyway.
Okay.
So I'll try to accelerate this a little bit.
Yeah, we'll never get through.
Education, that was another one where there wasn't a you know, Brattleboro values something, but it said principle on that one too.
Oh,
Something
look at
to-
that.
And I wondered if we had considered putting a link to transportation in the education chapter, just because there's a big chunk of that that has to do with safe routes to school and all that stuff. So, and pedestrian, you know. But I don't know if that's a big enough chunk of it to justify that. Is there a
But
link
it
to the?
did talk about,
There's
under healthy school communities, page 4 and 5, I do talk about safe routes to school. I
yeah.
think that based on, I think I need to add other priority projects potentially. I mean, we know that the issues at Academy School and in West Brattleboro Village are pretty well documented. So I think,
No, I'm saying you did put safe routes to school in here. I'm just wondering if there should be just an out-and-out link to the transportation
Oh.
chapter as well.
From
You know,
page
since,
4.
Since you had put
yep,
that stuff in there, just this thing that says for a further discussion of these issues, please see the
Okay.
transportation chapter or something. No, I think it's really good, and this was a lot of that, the stuff from, some of the stuff from the YMCA,
Yep.
you know, and
the
the
chili festival.
Yep.
TPEG discussion that we had.
Yeah.
I think it's really good. Just wondered if in the intro in the education chapter, if there should just be a little something in there about, you know, people may not realize the extent to which education and town government are separate.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, like we didn't. I mean,
Yeah.
we
That's a good
didn't.
point.
It wasn't blatant for all of us. You know, so just something about that, because even though the budget is so high and all that stuff, that there isn't that kind of, there's a disconnect there.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then updating the information about CCV as in full swing as it is right now, or whatever.
Yep.
As I mentioned for them, you mean, right?
Yeah.
Back there, a few pages back, page 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, CCV wasn't included in that.
And
That's what I meant.
and there's something about CCV that just doesn't talk about on page 6. Just what's happening right now, you know, that they're looking at a downtown campus and that sort of stuff. So,
Okay.
the energy chapter, the chart in there the electricity chart,
Which one?
residential versus average customer use on page 6. I didn't really understand. It says residential, account type residential, and oh, that's the number of accounts. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay. The
Yeah.
numbers are just too close to the average customer use
Yep.
for me to. Okay, I thought there was. Just,
Oh, it's actually pretty good. It's a nice. Basically, every human uses 1,000 kilowatts.
yeah. Okay, I got it.
Does the other number mean that Paul Cameron is earning his allocation? The reduction in commercial kilowatt hours?
Oh,
Or does that just represent the businesses that are no longer using electricity?
Probably both.
yep.
On page 7 in that chart, we talked about the parking garage being in there, and I don't
Yeah.
think it's in there yet.
Oh,
That's right, we asked for that to be added in.
What is it about that parking?
you know, I think it just doesn't want to go in there.
Forget about it sooner or later, right?
Okay.
And I will. It won't be long either. I'll forget about it when I get home tonight. So. I didn't know if it made any sense. I know CVPS is the only one that's in Brattleboro, but if it might be good to just mention about the merger.
Oh yeah.
And
What's
how that,
what's the status of that?
it's,
I mean, it may have held off.
I think it's underway. I mean,
Are you getting your refunds?
not yet.
Yeah, that's how I feel.
I think the tide's coming in, though. You can't stop the tide.
That's right.
Can't stop a bit of lobbying in Montpelier, more like it.
So
Okay.
I just wondered if it would be good, even just a sentence to mention that that's happening.
That we're very excited that they've merged.
Just that they merged.
I kind of like writing gas with a Z.
Yeah.
And we anxiously look forward to receiving our rebate.
Yeah, we're all waiting for the rebate.
Payback check.
Yeah, right. And then we can update that
We've
in the next town
scheduled the
plan.
payback
Oops,
check party.
oops, we didn't get that rebate.
Yeah, because all the execs are going to get their bonuses instead.
Yeah. Well, what else would you do a merger?
And I think the stated goals are really impressive and exciting. And I wondered if there should be just a little, even a box or something about the ICLE stuff.
Text box. We need text box.
Yes.
Yeah.
We do.
Yes,
Yeah.
we do. We've been told to
It's
find
not
more
even
text
been
boxes.
told. We gotta find
Okay.
text boxes.
Because it's you talk about it in here in a couple of places,
Yep.
but it would be kind of cool, I think, for people if these numbers are going to
Jump out.
appear, places like if once a year we say, and this is how we have progressed on our goals, whatever.
Right.
It'd be nice for people to know where the baseline comes from and where
Right.
the progress report comes from. So.
Okie doke. That's good.
Historic and scenic resources. I just want It's My Way or the Byway to appear in there someplace, if you don't mind.
Which byway? There's two.
Yeah, right.
Whatever. I
Connecticut
don't-
River or Molly Stark?
Molly Stark.
I just want
Molly
this.
Stark,
the
Connecticut
sentence
River.
in
So
there.
like
That's
last
all.
year. Yeah, we're going for the Blue Way now.
So I didn't have anything else in there. Yeah. And housing, I wonder if there should be a link to the economic development
Mhm.
chapter and something about workforce housing. Those words, I guess.
That's so like gone. That discussion.
Is that 20th century talk?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The whole,
I'm living back there, so.
Okay. Just thought I'd let you know.
And there's not a value, I don't think, in there.
No,
Oh, yeah, well, it doesn't say Brattleboro values, that's all.
It just says,
both the economic development and the housing chapters don't have their principles in terms of value. Brattleboro values, they're the only.
oh.
And education.
So they need to be rewritten to just.
All right.
I know you specifically redid the economic development one, but it has to be done in.
I thought at one point we decided to get rid of the value part because
Yep.
it was like so repetitive.
They all say that though.
We
Yeah.
messed up one way or the other.
I think we just sort of like randomly shook it, but
Yeah.
the last time I heard, everyone got really tired of everything starting off with values when it was so obviously a value statement.
Yeah, but that's what the principles.
It's also
Yeah.
possible that when I was writing, I took them from a document that had them on one page and we just wrote on top Brattleboro values
Oh,
and
yeah.
then
Yeah, blah, blah, blah,
listed
blah.
it.
Right,
So if I was cutting them from there,
right,
that's
Yeah.
probably.
right. It's a cutting and pasting trick.
The
Yeah, that's it.
last thing I have under housing, I mean, other than this, I think the housing chapter is real good, is that whole section. This is the only thing I think that could be dropped. How do you like that?
Wow.
On page 14, the inclusion of various tools, you say will not likely yield dramatic increases, but is worth considering their merits.
That whole section?
I would say if you're going to include all those things, they should be shortened up or something, just because, you know what I mean? Unless you want to,
I'm gonna list it.
yeah.
All right.
Because there's a couple things there, like inclusionary zoning, that I remember talking about that years ago and just thinking, wow. And mainly because we're not likely to encounter a situation where it's going to help anything at all, because we don't
Especially,
have
yeah, I mean, I think
that
especially
big a
given
div-
the market right now, the
Yeah.
pressure.
or even any time that I can think of, but I don't know.
I think the inclusion of them was the attempt to say, okay, well, what can the planning commission influence about housing, and it's through zoning.
Yeah, well, we
But
definitely,
I think it is worth taking a look at it.
well, we definitely wanted to have the cluster stuff in the raising densities. I mean, that was
Yeah.
important.
But isn't that more, well, I don't know.
That's
It's
different
okay.
than inclusionary
I don't
zoning.
feel
Yeah.
real strongly about that, but I thought I should at least suggest one thing
Yeah, I
that could
thought
be
we had
dropped.
talked about dropping inclusionary zoning at one point, so,
Yeah.
as well. So, I think it can definitely be shortened up.
Yep. All right. Yeah, maybe like into a one paragraph. I mean, it might not justify the bullety treatment.
Yeah,
So that's my list.
That's a pretty big paragraph.
it is.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So who's next?
Dana wanted to go. Didn't you? I thought when you went, I thought she had,
Go ahead.
no, I don't have any at the moment.
Joe?
No, I don't have my book with me, but I'm reading along as I go. The zoning here where it says, could you describe, I mean, what does that mean where you refer to inclusionary zoning? It says, there are some communities that have used but appropriate amount of growth to make it a useful tool.
Oh, have used it, but they had the appropriate
Oh,
amount of growth. So
oh.
Massachusetts, for
I see.
example, was starting to use it. Community, well, I think they passed a state law, but,
Yeah.
they are having that type of development where you could actually, or the amount of development that you could.
You mean
Request
any
developer to do
development where you could imply some sort of inclusionary restrictions or whatever, right?
There's been some interesting back in the mid to late 90s, or may have even been earlier in Massachusetts. There were many communities that either intentionally or unintentionally had zoning ordinances that made it extremely difficult for developers to construct affordable housing and didn't make explicit provisions for the provision of affordable housing within their boundaries. So we are talking about
Multi-unit, not even just affordable, weren't they having problems with?
they're having to some extent they're having problems with restrictions on multi-unit development. So any kind of condo type development or apartment block. And so the state passed I should say the Commonwealth passed a regulation that basically said whenever the amount of affordable housing stock in your community falls below 10% of the total, a developer who proposes a project that includes affordable housing is exempt from your zoning requirements.
Whoa.
Wow, bonus.
And that sort of smacked them around pretty good. And so a number of towns fell into that trap pretty quickly. But the way it's played out is that for whole lots of other complicated reasons that no one predicted at the time, it's still not really addressing the affordable housing problem. And but that's basically the way it worked. So developers could basically just go straight to the state and say, they said no, but they've got 8% of their total stock is affordable housing, and I'm promising to build 4 units of it, so I want yes. And they go, okay, you get yes. And towns in western Massachusetts, like Sunderland and so forth, confronted that. There was some not too far from here. So the part of that story is that it didn't matter necessarily. You didn't have to be close to Boston or something to be whacked by that. I think Burlington played with it a little bit.
I think they're the only ones.
I think they're the only ones.
Potentially. I mean, I think
Right.
California, like the Tahoe, some of the resort areas tend to have.
Certainly Colorado, ski towns, that kind of thing. And it comes about because there's a real need, partly because the gap between the average price and the price that people on an average income working in the community could afford was just huge. So the Californian resort towns, the Colorado ski towns, if you're talking about the average price being $1.5 million for, you know, the smallest condo you could get your hands on in the mid-2000s, and you're paying a high school teacher $100,000 a year, they're not going to get it. So it was a requirement, or police officers or anybody else. So they're having real trouble recruiting staff to fill, you know, public positions, basically, because they couldn't afford to live there. And then they were getting messed around with the Clean Air Act requirements and pollution, you know, air pollution and a whole bunch of other things from the commutes that were. So they were just really struggling. It's a little bit less acute, I'd say, outside of those areas. When Burlington did it, there was strong growth in the Burlington downtown market, and there wasn't a lot of provision for affordable housing in the downtown area. But I'd say maybe it's the only market in Vermont that comes close to having the kind of mechanism that you can do that with.
A basis that'll sustain that, right?
Yeah, you just need a certain amount of fairly strong and sustained activity to even make the tools work.
These suggestions, are these merely suggestions of these various tools, or are these proposals to incorporate in zoning?
I think the rationale of including them in the housing discussion was that once we got to the point where the town plan was adopted and we were going to discuss zoning changes, that this would be justification for considering certain kinds of zoning
A
changes.
framework to
Yeah.
follow?
Yep.
Yeah,
It's
I
a-
mean, we do recommend the PUD overlay district. We
Yeah.
definitely recommend clustering subdivisions.
Raising densities also, there's a lot, I mean, I personally live in an area of town that's rural residential, but that has housing that is developed, that is aged housing that's developed in a density that's way higher than what rural residential provides for. And I mean, it just seems like if you're in an area where your existing density is already higher than what the district provides for, you certainly would think you, like you say, where you've got the services, you think you'd want to encourage infill in those areas that are already, you know, in the town proper, whatever you want to call it.
Raising this, I mean, specifically in the rural and.
Not rural, but rural
Right,
residential.
but in rural residential, I think that those are two areas we've actually talked about upzoning.
Right, so increasing the minimum parcel size.
Right.
So to further focus, right.
So that it's not getting too dense. And then we want to increase the density, you know, we want to get residential on Putney Road. We want to get more residential on Canal Street up in that commercial area. So those would be areas where we'd be increasing density. And then promoting infill where it's can happen.
Then I guess I would, to that end, I would say that in doing so, I would hope that the planning commission would look at examining, as they go through that zoning ordinance reworking, at examining what districts are where and whether or not those districts are in fact consistent with the existing buildup or whatever, if you will, in those certain areas. Because I mean, I've been here my whole life, and there seem to be some areas that are more residential, not rural residential, and then probably conversely, there are others that are more rural than rural residential. But,
I think in general, what I'd say is along major arteries or major streets in the rural residential district, and I'm not just thinking of your neighborhood, but I'm thinking of others in West Brattleboro. It does kind of have a suburban neighborhood feel. It's
where it's an acre and a half.
Right.
Yeah. Where there's like 3 houses in an acre and a half.
right. So
Right, not just my area. There are
No.
some others. In
Route
West
30,
Brattleboro that are like
the Route
that.
30
Yeah.
area is another example. There's parts of West Brattleboro that fall into the same kind of category. Parts of South Street, stretches of Guilford Street, and so forth. So, and that's the typical pattern of northern New England sprawl. That if you build a road and it's got any kind of services on it, and that could be as minimal as a school bus, or it could include water and sewer, then you'll get that kind of infill housing, and pretty soon you're looking at kind of unplanned suburbanization of areas that you didn't really want or expect to be suburbanized. So what we're doing, what we're proposing in the land use chapter more than here, this was written before the land use chapter was, but they're kind of flagging these issues for the land use chapter and flagging these issues specifically to do with housing, is to increase the minimum lot size for rural residential, and industrial, and for reasons to do with, development patterns that we think are perverse with each one of those districts. And then conversely, so that's the discouragement, if you like, for residential development in rural and rural residential, and encouraging residential development between 91 and the river in particular, by making that a PUD overlay area, and encouraging higher densities where we've got, comprehensive infrastructure that's in fairly good shape and they're walkable communities. So I think there's always going to be areas of town that for one reason or another are non-conforming. We hope, everyone really hopes to keep it as small as possible. I know from the DRB standpoint, they really hate it when they confront non-conforming uses and they've got a development application before them because it makes things a little odd. But if you go around and you basically switch everything over so that the pattern that you observe in your neighborhood becomes conforming, then you'll get a lot more of the pattern that you already observe, and that's the reverse of where the Planning Commission has been going on that.
Do these chapters reference the maps you guys were working on at all?
Yes.
So if you say these are the PUD districts, does it call them out specifically and talk about why they are?
Well, the PUD overlay area is basically, I'm not sure if the map is included in, it occurs in the land use chapter.
I
And
can take a look at this.
I think we may be able to make a stronger link to that in the housing chapter, but basically everything east of 91 and south, and from the top to the bottom, so from the Dummerston line in the north and the Guildford line in the south, will become PUD overlay, and then the existing PUDs that are outside of 91, so that predominantly that is the Austin School and Delta Campus associated with Bob Johnson.
This should have a map
You've got a map
in land use.
in land use. So those are also PUD districts, and so with that, by simplifying the PUD process, changing it from a use to a type of development, what we would do is hopefully encourage people to use the PUD approach. And from doing that, we expect that they'll get higher levels of density and more sensitive development relative to the neighborhood after the changes have been made.
But they'll need to go do it, they'll need to develop as a PUD in order to do so,
Yes.
right?
Right. So as right now, a PUD is really a zoning change. It won't be a zoning change once, if the town plan goes into effect and then we revise the zoning ordinance, it will no longer be a zoning change. It'll be just a different process for applying for a permit.
Will there be residential, commercial, and industrial PUD overlay areas?
No, there'll just be PUD. There'll just be a PUD overlay, and it depends on the underlying zoning district as to
Whether it's retail,
As to what the uses are.
residential, Right.
right. So a PUD in the industrial district would include all the uses that are listed in the chart that are permitted or conditional for industrial zoning
What about
districts.
okay, so a PUD then that was in a rural residential would only include all those that were in rural residential, not those in rural or residential.
Correct. And I think that effectively there almost all of the rural residential areas are outside the PUD overlay. And so what we would prefer there is that if somebody was going to develop that property, they would use a conservation subdivision approach, which would still result in a clustering of the housing and a preservation of open space
And potential density bonus.
and potential density bonuses. Yeah,
Is Family PUD,
Yes.
yes.
Vermont Agricultural?
Yep.
Existing PUDs.
Right. Existing PUDs are grandfathered in, all of them.
That's east of the highway, but that is the rural residential zone to which I refer.
Right.
If you didn't find your PUD map in there, go back for your, I think in your
You
May
bind it,
meeting,
right.
you got that.
So-
or
Right.
Okay,
Yeah, well,
First May meeting, you
first
got
May
that
meeting.
map.
Right.
You can stick it in.
Right.
okay. So
Yeah.
what sort of happened tonight, I'm sorry, go ahead, Timberlake. I wanted to see if Maggie would like to say anything, and just point out that what's sort of happened is that we've gone through half to two-thirds of the chapters, and the rest, the other four are here, and anything that anybody wants to talk about, this kind of stuff that we've been doing tonight, we'll do next time again, and it won't be restricted to chapters that we haven't talked about yet. We'll go back, as much as we need to. And I'm sure that you guys would like to see things come through in emails,
Yep.
if that's as well. So,
Or just mark up your
Yeah, mark it up.
Mark it up.
Maybe even the spelling errors, the
Just mark it
grammatical
up.
stuff, mark it up.
put your name on it so that we know
I'll
who it
give you
is.
that if you want.
Right. Right.
so if I could just, Maggie, would you like to speak to things?
Yes, I would. Maggie Barton, Town Plan Advisory Group, and I'm assuming that the Town Plan Advisory Group will meet at least one more time based on your comments that there was interest. So, we'll have an opportunity to go through this as the Town Plan Advisory Group, as you're doing here. But I do have some comments as we've been talking, or as you've been talking, I've been talking, and specifically on the land use chapter. But one of the things that, when you were talking about the agriculture chapter, which I don't have with me, I don't know if CSAs are mentioned
Yep,
in
they
there. Okay, so that would certainly be sort of an aspect of the income producing agriculture that we'd be talking about. And there was earlier discussion about the goals, policies, and actions, and the text not, as Liz had commented on, and I'm not sure if that was resolved one way or the other, whether that's something that needs to happen necessarily, whether it would be nice to have those three goals, policies, and actions be an outline for the text, but I'm not sure if you
I
had.
think I need to spend some time with it. I mean, I know with the natural resources, I think it could be done
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. I like the idea that it's an outline, and I think it's problematic if the action steps and are not fleshed out in the text. I think that's the whole point of the text.
Well, the way I read these chapters, and I'm sure you do this, and this is just the format, is you have that sort of that goals, policies, and actions, and the outline piece, if you will, in the beginning, and then looking at the reality of the situation, whatever the chapter is, what's currently in place, and then talking about, going forward, if you will, future planning. And so is that the piece that would then naturally follow the outline? I mean, certainly the current existing situation isn't going to change based on the...
No. So that roughly that's the format that we're
that's
following.
the format. Gary had mentioned earlier, and I'm sure it sounds like the Planning Commission had agreed that an economic development person was a good idea, or that was a suggestion. And I don't know if anybody else saw the Fish article in today's Brattleboro Reformer about the muraling all around the corner of the Brooks House and all, and just what that represents versus, actual retail space that we've lost, and how quickly that's going to change. And that's just sort of an underscore for maybe the need in this community for someone dealing specifically with, looking at how to develop that. At the same time, right across the street, the new little business in, say, the corporation's old space is a wonderful addition to the community. So, it's hard to know, but I think certainly an economic development person is somebody that specifically is looking at these things, and how long is that corner, that, around the corner in Brattleboro, going to be just murals versus, active, vital, occupied space that's enlivening the community and providing jobs. Just going through the land use chapter, just a few comments I had. I don't know if you intend this, but I find, as I'm reading through a lot of these chapters, you do have the policies listed, and sometimes there are action steps underneath them, and sometimes there aren't. And is that intentional?
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes the policy doesn't necessarily.
Sometimes we think the policy needs to be there. I mean, I need to go through and see, because exactly which ones. But I think the thought is sometimes there's policies that just need to be there for action-taking purposes.
Oh, okay. And so
it's
there
not
may not necessarily be a specific action.
Might not lead to an action step.
Yeah.
Some of them even sound like action steps. I mean, there are recommendations that sound like they could be an action, but there isn't any any specified action step that follows them. So it's when I read them, it's sort of it's a little unclear to me, and it may be intentional, and that's fine. But it wasn't clear to me whether it was intended as just a policy statement or an action step or both. And also, I note that on some of the action steps, there are actual entities designated,
Right.
and some of them there are not. And so for consistency purposes, I'm not sure if that's something you probably are aware of. I thought Gary's comment earlier about, and I forget what the point, the issue was that you were specifically referring to, but you had mentioned, Gary, to refer to, to see, I think it's the wording was for further discussion, see whatever chapter. And I think that would be great to use throughout this, where there's an overlap or meant to be, where something is just hinted at, say, in this chapter specifically, for instance, in the land use chapter. Where do I see it? Just be patient with me for a second. It had to do with dealing with flooding. And I'll give you the... Of course, I can't find it. On page 1. I flipped almost to the end and I couldn't find it. Well, that's because it was page 1, where you talk about, it's 2.1, provide the highest degree of flood protection, et cetera, et cetera. And the action steps talk about, reference that, but, and I noted that further into the chapter you do mention maintain and enhance natural areas and open space land, and that would be page 2 of 4.3. And then under actions, preserve, et cetera. But I wonder if for more information along the lines of, because it's not just a land use issue, it's a natural resource issue as well, and that could be designated, for more information on protecting the health of waterways or whatever, reference chapters XXX, whatever it might be.
Probably prefer to see that in the body of the text than in this part.
But somewhere in there, so that it's as you're reading through, you know where to go to get more information on, well, okay, this is land use and flood protection, but it's also maintaining the health of the waterway. So how do
I think
we?
it's page 7 where we
Yeah.
talk a lot about.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then again, I already mentioned that. Okay.
It could be too when this goes on the net and it's got links and everything in it, that'll change the dynamics of that some too.
Yeah.
We're really
Yeah.
trying to build a lot of that in so that you can search keywords and that you'll have hot links. So if it says something like see the natural resources chapter or chapter 5, whatever it is, it'll be a live link and you'll just click on it and it'll take you there.
Is it going to be a PDF or is it going to be on a real website? Is it on the town's website?
No, it'll be the PDF.
Page 7, I think it's great that this whole page is reduce the impact of flooding and erosion, and everything you've listed here is, I just attended 2 separate meetings in the state, one in Montpelier and one in Royalton, South Royalton, sponsored by both VNRC and the Vermont Law School on living with Vermont rivers. And it's just incredible, the amount of stuff that's coming out about after Irene, the effects of that and what we have learned. And it's not to say we've never had these problems before in this state, because we've had hurricanes and floods and but it seems like each time everybody kind of relaxes and goes back to the normal. And this time it looks like it's different. So this is very relevant, and I would applaud you guys for including this in the depth that it's in, and it's stressed in here. The importance of really looking at what we need to do to prevent Irene effects in the future. So I would say that everything I'm hearing and learning from these conferences really supports this. Okay, let me just, again, I think it's great, the comments around supporting conservation subdivisions. It's a great idea. On page 11, and this might be a spelling error, which future land use areas, the overarching role of the future land use, or is it meant to be goal?
I think roll is right.
Yeah.
Role is right?
Yeah, and it's not as in something that you eat. It's
Yeah.
spelled right. So
No, I didn't think it was.
that's all good.
Okay. And on page 14, under land use, the implementation of land use plan. And I think, again, this may be a reiteration of in a different wording that Gary had mentioned earlier about removing the requirement for market analysis for buildings larger than 65,000 square feet. And then right under that is reduce the amount of impervious surface allowed in the commercial zoning district. So I would question whether those are contradictory to a certain extent. Unless maybe you require a pervious surface for parking lot?
Roof gardens as
You know,
well.
roof gardens
Yeah,
or
that's
whatever,
what
but I
mean,
mean,
Yeah, at face,
consistent.
no, at
Vegetative
face
walls.
value, they'd be mutually exclusive, but I actually don't. On the basis of what's there already, and on the basis of what approaches are available to developers, I would actually say that they're not necessarily
Yeah,
inconsistent.
okay. It just struck me,
Yeah.
because
Anything
they're
that's
right
over
next to each other.
65,000 square feet is going to have vegetative walls.
Yeah, something,
You know.
something that would make,
Yeah, the whole thing be biodegradable every time it rains.
right.
Melt in the next
I
storm.
think for the moment, that's all I had.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for coming and listening and commenting, Maggie. Just, I'll reiterate that, we'll be doing this again. So, if
And
you
you
have
will be-
anything else.
Yeah.
So if you have anything else, and then we will have the TPAG meeting too, so, yeah.
So just as a quick No, we can make available these headings if it makes it, if this is working for people to identify these kinds of things.
Yeah, I wrote them down just so
Okay.
when I go through, it'll
We can
help.
give you worksheet or something.
Yeah, we thought about developing a worksheet or something, but we wanted to sort of try it out first. So if this seems to work,
Yeah,
then,
it says in this memo here, we're getting worksheets.
all right.
Oh,
Oh dear.
we're editing them. We had talked about it.
We have a promise
And then
again.
we pulled back, and then when Gary and I met yesterday, he had suggested using
Right,
flip
okay.
charts. I think it was,
I
All
like
right.
the
And
colors
we're supposed to
a
get the
lot. I didn't say
introduction,
anything
too.
about
We
the
don't have the
colors,
introduction.
but I like those colors.
All right, so,
Yeah.
yep.
So,
yeah.
Kimberly, I cut you off at one point a long time ago.
Yeah, that's what I'm,
Did you have anything?
Remember?
Well, yeah, I guess right now, I'll be honest, I haven't had a chance to read through all of this yet. I will before the next meeting. The one question I had was the growth boundary that we had discussed with 91, and we don't really mention it that much. And I don't know if that's sort of a deciding factor with some of the decisions being made as far as land use goes.
It is, we discussed it,
It's in the future land use.
yeah, I mean, we don't call it a growth boundary because planning circles.
Kind of a little loaded.
Yeah, it's a loaded term.
Word, yeah.
Did we?
do you, while you're looking for that, do you want us to write in these things with things to hand back to you? Is that-
Sure,
You can.
exactly, yeah.
Or whatever
Oh,
That's-
all
works
right,
for you.
all right.
That's very,
So this isn't a permanent, I mean, even though it's a draft, I mean, we have lots of other drafts, but we can write on this and then
Sure.
hand
That's
it
highly
back to you
effective.
if we've
Yep.
done, okay. That
So in
wasn't
the
clear.
intro to the future land use on page 6, I think we kind of get it at it, is investing in established areas rather than fringe locations. And then I think that you, maybe in the economic development chapter, I think this is an area where you said it better,
oh.
kind of orienting towards the north-south.
Did the
axis.
historic pattern of developments being east-west along the Route 9 Whetstone
Yeah,
corridor?
I
Where'd
think
that
this
turn
is one
up?
of the places where Liz said you said it better in economic development than it's said in land use. So I'm going to write it down
We might just
as a place we need to strengthen. in
cut
land
it
use.
or cut it out of economic development or copy it across to here. So yeah, I think that's where it is.
But we don't call it growth boundary. It's more orienting on a north-south access. As opposed
Right.
to-
And the so-called tools that we're going to use are medium-sized sticks and kind of chunky carrots.
Assorted doubles.
So with no dip. So because we don't. What I'd say, one of the weirder things to address here is that we have such low levels of growth. You could describe it as all pretty spasmodic for about the last 40 years. So it just happens in fits and starts and in odd kind of places. You have to sort of really stare at a map and think through exactly the age of each subdivision and why they occur, where they occur, and how it really happened. And a pattern does emerge when you sort of like shake it and stare at it for a really long time, but you've really got to think about it. And so upending that or ending it is not going to be overnight. It's going to take a long time. So as one example, if we increase the minimum parcel size in rural residential from what is now 1 point, in rural residential,
1.5.
it's 1.5. If we increase it from 1.5 to 3, probably find the price of a 3-acre parcel changing a little bit. I can't even really easily predict in what direction, but if you really wanted to live on a particular street or you had a parcel of land or whatever, it wouldn't necessarily stop you from living there. So it's not an outright prohibition on any more houses in rural residential, which would be crazy because it's actually rural residential. But we're just changing the density, and it would take a long time to see that effect come out because not every parcel in rural residential is exactly 1.5. Many of them are already 3 or above, right? So what I'm talking about is there's some pretty subtle plays in here that are not really outside the geek set that this room really is when it comes to zoning. It's not going to be immediately apparent to the
See how he thinks of us.
Yeah, you're
Ordinary
right.
observer.
Oh, that geek said,
Could
"Can we
you
get
call us
shirts for that
nerds
or
instead of
something?"
geeks, please?
All right.
It's
So
a nicer.
the other question I had was, it seems with all of the discussion that we've had, we're trying to encourage density specifically in the downtown, and it never really says that. It calls out general areas, but it never says the downtown specifically, infill projects, or, and I don't even know if that's totally necessary. I think it's obvious to us that we would like that to happen, we'd like to encourage that however possible, but to somebody reading this from the outside who would potentially develop one of the sites, is it that apparent to them? I mean,
I think it's a good question, and I think I think it's probably not. And I think that specifically, you know, when we talk about the neighborhood center, future land use areas, I think we should hit them over the head with it. Like, hey, we want more density on Putney Road. Like, I think it's a good thing. to hit 'em over the head with.
and then as far as parking in the downtown, I don't know if this is in the transportation chapter. I'm just sort of, after going to that meeting with the CCV and Vermont Technical College, and one of their main concerns was that they wanted parking nearby, obviously. And if something like that were to happen downtown, is there a way to write in the plan provisions for added parking? Is it another level in the parking garage? Is it another level above the, I mean, I don't know, but there, to accommodate that is
Harmony
that
parking garage, right?
Harmony parking garage?
Sure.
Yeah,
You
right.
know, I mean, but is there an opportunity for
The
more
higher Grove
parking?
lot.
Because
The
that's a
Harmony
make or break
campus garage.
for businesses.
I think
Or is it even necessary?
I think you need a parking study, because I think that perception of parking in communities is often very different than reality. And so it's easy for a business to say,
Yeah.
you know, we want more parking. And the two locations that CCV are looking at have municipal lots right nearby.
Yeah.
Both of them do.
Right.
But would those lots be full if,
Not on the basis of the current size of the campus on Putney Road.
I mean, I look at the High Street lot and it doesn't ever really look full to me.
Right.
Can't-
So High Grove is around about 1/3 full most days. And that means that there's more than 30 available spaces. It's about twice the walking distance from the far end of High Grove, so it's the Grove Street. Get it? High and Grove. It's about twice the distance from the Grove Street end to Brooks House as it is from the far end of CCV's current parking lot to their current building now, is my guess. And in rough observations of CCV, I'd be surprised if they have much more than 30 vehicles there at a time associated with student use. And so there you go. If they all chose to park in that one parking lot, pretty much all of them would be accommodated straight off. Now the difference is it's free for them to park on Putney Road, and it's not free at the High Grove. But the reverse argument can also be made that if you don't have a car, accessing classes at CCV on Putney Road is more challenging because you're forced to use the bus, which is at best once every hour in the morning and in the afternoon and not in the middle of the day. Whereas downtown, and depending on where you lived or how you arranged it, it's actually more accessible if you don't have a car. So the challenge for an institution like the community college is to figure out whether they want to pursue the suburban model of development, which is what I'd argue Putney Road is, or whether they want to go with a downtown development model, which means that their expectations of their students will differ and the kinds of students that they may attract might be a little bit different. And I get that community colleges in particular have a strong connection with people already in the workplace, trying to acquire GED or whatever so that they can continue their education. And so being able to park close to your classroom is is regarded as a big plus. I think the parking choices available to you for downtown campus in Brattleboro still remain pretty good.
So the parking study would be included in that downtown master plan, maybe?
Um,
I'm not saying that
And
the
that-
planning study would be done, I
Right.
just think that oftentimes the perception is different.
right. There's a lot of surface parking downtown. It's not as bad as some towns, but there's a lot of surface parking downtown. There's the parking garage structure itself, which also is probably less than a third utilized at this point. So there's a lot of extra capacity, and I think we have to remember what are the expectations that we're laying out for future, literally for future land use. And I think the expectation is that people will drive individual cars less and use walking and public transit and bicycles more. So it might be kind of short-sighted to jag on a parking requirement for something like CCV downtown now, when in 10 or 15 years that kind of commitment would be seen as redundant.
Yeah. So as far as the Brooks House closing the tunnel, if that were to happen, it's going to change the flow of traffic, vehicular traffic downtown pretty significantly. I mean, it as a I hate to say it, but for people looking, there's no way to get. It's awkward because going around the Brooks House, Elliott Street, Main Street, Flat Street, there's no easy way to circle around if you're trying to look for a parking spot, unless you're parking in a garage.
Definitely changes the dynamics.
Yeah, big time.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. It
So-
probably reduces the amount of cutting through that people would do,
Yeah.
which may not be altogether bad if you're trying to improve the quality of the experience of being in the lot and regarding at least some of it as open space for stores and restaurants and so forth, which I think they envisage as part of the plan. So less again, at least at that end near the Brooks House, less about parking and more about people.
Yeah, but then I guess where I'm going with this is that, so if you close that, it's harder for people who aren't from here, who don't really know their way around, to understand that if you do need to, let's say you're looking for a parking spot downtown. It's First Friday, it's 3 o'clock on First Friday, and you're like, oh, I'm going to get to Brattleboro early. People who don't know, there's no, the density downtown doesn't really make you feel like, oh, well, if I just take a left here, I'm sure I can get around the block and just sort of turn around. You know what I mean? Because it's all these open-ended streets it's confusing, and there's no clear path to get. Does that make sense?
I think it does. I think, again, it's kind of a perception problem. I think anybody new to it, genuinely new to a town like this is going to take a little while to orient themselves, and you sort of deal with what you get on the day. I think that BAB and the Chamber and the town are working together to do a bunch of things with parking services. So they want to signpost parking areas, surface parking areas more effectively. They want to assign 911 addresses to them so that they can then be incorporated into Google Maps, and so that you can use an app to actually identify where the parking spaces are. And so that at the entrance of surface parking areas like the Highgrove lot, you would be shown that if this is, if you were here, if this is full, this is where the other parking spaces are, which is a sort of a standard complement of signs and approaches that you'd see in towns that have paid attention to this. And I think relative to other towns of a similar size in New England, we've got some unique conflicts between the train, malfunction junction, and so forth that make some of the decisions of drivers who aren't familiar a little bit more difficult. But it's not...
I mean, especially when we're talking about density, it seems like having that. And
well, I think
I mean, as a planner, and I'm thinking about this from a pedestrian design standpoint. there's all these streets that sort of just like, you can stop right here, and it's just like, where am I supposed to walk now? There's no way, you know, when people go shopping, they walk down one side of the street and then they come down the other because there's variety on both sides, right? That's how people, when they're walking around exploring, it's kind of what happens. But on Flat Street, it's kind of like, I'm at a motorcycle shop, now what do I do? Now it's a little strip mall complex. So encouraging density to sort of wrap around just seems like...
Well, let me interrupt a second here.
Yeah.
We have one more thing that we want to talk about tonight, but I mean, that would be a good subject probably for our next meeting, because land use is doing that.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and I would think that in a downtown plan, they'll be talking about
Yep.
traffic, and they'll be talking about pedestrians, and they'll
Right.
be talking about parking.
Yeah.
'Cause
I think so,
those
that
are
would-
all things that are vital,
I think that,
you know.
right, that it'll all be encompassed in the master plan. Yep.
So, Sue, I didn't know if you wanted to just take a couple of minutes. We'll be done by 8:30, but just a couple of minutes to talk about implementation.
Sure, it started, I have done some work on an implementation chapter. On one side is kind of what I've worked on based on our actions and policies. On the other side is Williston, which is one that Gary liked a lot. I think
I love
Town Plan
Williston.
Advisory Group of Williston as well.
Have you been there?
And so,
Yes, once.
Just checking.
I've been to virtual Williston, though, and it's a fabulous place.
Yeah, virtual Wilson's pretty nice.
Williston has tons of,
So as I started to work
Sprawl.
through it, I think, and this was, I maybe used a different, I started defining, trying to put a priority to it. So what are those actions that are just constantly ongoing? So those are the support ones that are listed, and what's short-term, mid-term, long-term. And then I got hung up with our plan's only good for 5 years, so does assigning years to it really, is that really a good way to do it? And Gary and I talked a little bit about it. Well, maybe it could be, what was it, immediate and...
Someday.
someday, yeah, right.
But it was...
Maybe.
It was basically, we were talking about whether maybe the horizon should be 5 years and then out past 5 years. you
Right,
know.
so the immediate is in the life of this plan.
Yeah.
Kind of the longer term is, hey, if we get to it earlier, that's great, but...
Yeah.
Um,
So you'd have the sense of, 5 years from now, there would be a set of things that would move into the done list, and there would be a set of things that maybe would move from the post 5 years into the 1 to 5 year for the next rewrite or next update of the plan.
I also tried to, we included a cost column. I think that came out of Williston.
Yeah.
But as I started going through it, it was like, boy, it's really difficult to estimate how much some of these things are going to cost. I mean, a stormwater management plan, all right, I could probably put a ballpark figure to it. But for some other recommendations, it's really
Do we need to include cost?
I think it's useful so that we can see that we're proposing a lot of things that really, there's a cost to it. So it's either the volunteer boards or it's staff, and there's a cost to that. But in terms of actual capital, we're not throwing a bunch of money towards things. So I think it's useful in that way. But I think the other side of it is that don't really know how much things are going
That's
to
right.
cost.
That's right. That's fine. Are we putting something there that's going to just cause more problems for ourselves or for you?
Well, but if you think about how it might be used later on is, and I don't know how you term it, if it would be something that would be termed a low cost, medium cost, high cost, but or if you wanted to make a link to anything that would be capital funded, you know, that could link back to the capital plan, you know, that kind of stuff. It would be an opportunity to at least let somebody
Right.
in the future prioritize some of
Right.
this stuff based on, yeah, we don't have much money, but we've got this down as a short-term, high priority. So why don't we go after those things and call them the low-hanging fruit, for instance? And why don't we take that one and put it in the capital budget?
Can
I
we
don't know.
can we think of things like capital commitments and the answer so as the heading for a column, and then the answer is yes, no, or a price. So if you're going to make a capital commitment and you intended to do it within the next 5 years, then we should have either a rough estimate, like a very rough estimate of how much it was going to cost. So take the police fire complex as an example. We're most of the way through a feasibility study right now for whatever reason, and there's going to be a public hearing on it, you know, a special town meeting, I should say, special town meeting very soon. So there's been some work on, well, okay, so what are our needs in regard, you know, why do we need a police to address conditions for police and fire services? And the answer is because they don't meet current requirements, and there's you know, serious issues.
What's wrong with this building?
It's beautiful.
But in terms of your chart,
And then the answer to the capital commitment is yes. And in that instance, you might want to put a ballpark figure in of whatever the feasibility study shows of $12 or $17 million or whatever it is.
but that's going to have a feasibility study. Many of these things, some
Well, yeah,
things
but
aren't going to
just-
have that, though.
Just hang on a second. So where you've got a known, where you want to make progress within the life of this plan, we should have a rough idea of the capital commitment. We might be suggesting other things in here that involve a capital commitment, but it's not known.
Right.
It's not known yet. But you still want to flag it as something that the capital, the finance committee, the select board, and so forth should begin to think about what that really means.
So then it
Right.
could be
And
yes, and it could be to be determined.
Yes,
or something.
exactly. And and then you
That's
can
good.
still rank those as the most important amongst those.
Sure.
And that would, given that if we don't have a figure for it, it's not going to happen in the next 5 years already. We already know it couldn't happen within 5 years if we don't know how much it costs today, right? So
This
that's
is like a conversation starter or
Right.
a conversation
Yes, exactly.
continuer,
right.
and a way to get everybody talking about what it's going to take.
Then there's another commitment, which is a budget commitment. So if you're going to create an economic development officer position, then it's a budget commitment. And we might identify other things in here that are budget commitments as well,
Right.
that fall into that category.
Streets, sidewalks.
So we might, the implication to be drawn from the improvement of sidewalks and, you know, a
Bike
higher
lanes.
level of maintenance is that it does have a budget impact. And so just flag it as, yes, it does. And it doesn't matter for me at this point so much that we know exactly how much that budget commitment is going to be, but it's something that can be carved off or taken out of the town plan, and people can look at pricing that more carefully and then also rank them more carefully. So if it comes down to a choice between an extra person at Public Works to work on sidewalks versus an economic development person, which one does the town think is more important, right? That kind of thing. And then a lot of what we do is an ongoing commitment. We would probably augment it with grants and so forth. So to do the downtown master plan, I'd expect grants to support that, but that staff of the planning officer expected to be involved in that some percentage of the time. The same with the rewriting of the zoning and subdivision regulations. I would say from a budget standpoint, it's going to absorb a lot of our time for the next 5 years, actually. But, and to be augmented with grants.
Security for you guys,
There you
right?
go. And then we'll decide at the end of the 5 years, let's start over. So that's what I think we can break it out in that way, and it might be a little bit more helpful, and it might also then align a little bit better with the time frame stuff. Because again, a lot of the things like land use control and land use regulation, that's ongoing. I mean, as long as we've got zoning and subdivision regulations, we're always going to do that. We mentioned, I think, the absence of building permits, that we don't issue building permits, for instance. If we were to add that function in, we would be looking at a really major budgetary commitment. I don't think we are seriously talking about that, but so that's just an example. Do you want to see if we can rejig this with that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I think, you know, the thing that's really good about this and about approaching it the way that you're describing is that it shows anybody that picks it up that a lot of thought went into this and that it's realistic, you know, and I think that's what it needs to be. It needs to be a realistic look at, in every way that we can look ahead, you know, these are the kind of costs we're talking about, these are the kind of time commitments. Even if we don't know what they are, at least whoever picks it up will know that we were thinking about it at least, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Well, I
So
think it
my
advances the dialogue a lot.
yeah.
My last quick question, because we are past 8:30, is if we identify the responsibility here, do we still want it identified in each chapter? Something to think about
Yeah, okay.
for the next meeting.
We could do it with colours.
Maggie?
Just a quick question, and this doesn't need to be answered, just a thought. I don't know if, this is great, I really like this, but are these, it looks like for each chapter, this is going to be laid out this way. So is there a way to, or have you thought about doing this, or does it not make sense to do this to, and I know it's the town's responsibility, and I'm assuming by that you mean the planning commission and the select board to decide what happens in the 5, 4 to 6, 1 to 3 years, 4 to 6 years, however it's laid out. Does this chart want to lay out priorities based on what each chapter seems to indicate are key issues, as in to give the town an opportunity to say, well, the town plan developers, writers' input suggests that this is a priority, so maybe this thing should be considered, rather than just giving an arbitrary list. I'm just thinking, you know, this is not a suggestion, it's just a thought as to how to, if I were going to get a list like this, I'd love to be able to say, oh, okay, but these 2 things at the top were the suggested priority issues to consider. And I might not consider those first if, as the town, the 3rd or 4th one on the list is more important, and we agree that it is, but the creators of this plan, based on the input, have said this 1 and 2 seem to be priority issues, whether or not they come with expenses or not attached to them.
One of the columns is priority,
Yeah.
short,
Yeah, but,
medium.
well,
It's more of a time frame than a priority. I mean, as I
Yeah.
hear you speak to it,
So-
and it makes me think of that capital budget document
Yes.
from ICMA. And while I like that, it would require us to come up with some sort of subjective ranking.
Yes.
yeah, so I don't even know, but it's just a thought.
Yeah,
And
no,
it may not work, you know, but it may.
What,
Well, it might be better than setting a time frame, because it's hard to know too how long it's going to take to complete something.
well, what I'd say is, if we expect to do something within the space of 5 years, so take the rewriting of the subdivision and the zoning ordinance, we expect that to be done by the time the plan expires. So that's a high priority, and all high priority things happen within the life of the plan. There are other things, like our participation in the National Flood Insurance Program, which is just ongoing. So you could have high priority is is the life of the plan. Medium priority is 5 to 10. Low priority is 10 and out, because so much is unknown that you don't know when you're going to get to it. And then the only other category would be just ongoing commitments. So that would then when you're also looking at the budget thing, you're capturing that information with it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that?
Yeah.
I mean, basically, what I would say is anything that we've agreed to do in this plan within the life of the plan, there's probably more than enough. We probably won't get it all done, and it's instantly the highest priority. Right?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, and I think that is in 5 years that this is not a whole redo again. It's dropping things out, updating.
Yeah.
It's not.
Right.
I think at Town Plan Advisory we talked about that.
Right. If the framework for this plan works well, the next revision to the town plan will be simply a revision of this document, and we'll be
And it
updating
won't
it.
take 2 years again?
No, hopefully not. Well, we had a lot to reset, so.
Yeah, a lot, real lot.
Took more than 2 years.
Not really the Planning Commission's time. It would take more than 2 years.
Okay.
Okay,
Move to adjourn.
is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
All right.
Aye.
Thank
All
you.
those opposed?
All those opposed, yeah.